Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the ISAS panel discussion titled IPEF Negotiations Turning a New Corner. I'm Ramita Iyer, Research Analyst at ISAS. Before we proceed with the event, we would appreciate it if participants could mute their microphones when the speakers are in conversation. If you have any questions or comments, please post them on the chat box. They will be consolidated for speakers to respond to during the discussion session. I'm also happy to inform you that today's session is being live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. Today's panel discussion will focus on the decisions delivered by the IPEF until now and examine the prospects of its further progress. We're delighted to have with us Mr. Shumanto Chaudhary, Principal Advisor, International Trade Policy Division, Confederation of Indian Industry, India. Dr. Radhika Kumar, Advisor, Infrastructure Policy, Trade, Oceans and Natural Resources Directorate, Commonwealth Secretariat, UK. Dr. Jayant Menon, Senior Fellow, Regional Economic Studies Program, ISAS Yusuf Ishaq Institute. Dr. Mia Mikic, Research Fellow, Waikato University, New Zealand, and Advisor at Large, Asia-Pacific Research and Training Network on Trade. We also have with us Mr. Stephen Olson, Senior Research Fellow, Heinrich Foundation. The chairperson for the event is Dr. Amatendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics at ISAS. I now invite Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia, Director at ISAS, to deliver the welcome remarks. Dr. Sivia, please.
Thank you, Ramita. Distinguished speakers, participants, and observers. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I thank you for joining us for this afternoon's panel discussion entitled IPEF Negotiations Turning a New Corner. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, or the IPEF, which was announced by United States President Joe Biden in May 2022, has become the centerpiece of the United States administration's economic strategy in the Indo-Pacific. With its emergence 5 years after the US withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the IPEF is viewed as a tool to reassert the US economic engagement with this part of the world and provide an alternative to the Chinese-led economic order. Importantly, the IPEF deviates from the framework of traditional free trade agreements that are focused on market access concessions and tariff liberalization. As a framework that instead focuses on standard setting, the IPEF provides a blueprint to a new, albeit untested, kind of economic engagement in the region. Since the first in-person ministerial meeting was held in September last year, where the 4 pillars of the IPEF, trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy were laid down, the framework has made significant progress. So far, 3 negotiating rounds, with the most recent one being in Singapore last month, and a number of ministerial and senior official meetings have been held. The ongoing negotiations have made robust progress with a substantial conclusion of talks on Pillar 2, supply chains, announced at the ministerial meeting on 27 May in Detroit. The supply chain agreement aims to strengthen supply chains and establish a framework for cooperation on priorities such as workforce development, supply chain monitoring, investment promotion, and crisis response. Progress has also been made in the other 3 pillars on trade, clean economy, and fair economy. And it's expected that the IPEF will be concluded in November 2023 in time for the APEC summit. Our institute, ISAS, is a research institute in the National University of Singapore that works in contemporary South Asia. At ISAS, we are committed to tracking the latest developments around the world and analyzing how they affect South Asia and South Asia's connectivity and trade with other regions of the world. The IPEF is a major subject of work of our Trade and Economic Research Cluster. Since May last year, when the IPEF was announced, we have brought out a number of written publications, released podcasts, and organized events pertaining to the subject. Given the substantive conclusion of Pillar 2 of the IPEF, as well as the progress made on the remaining pillars, we believe that today's discussion is timely and important. I'm delighted to say that we have a select group of eminent scholars and practitioners who will examine several key issues relating to the IPEF. Some of them are familiar faces and some new. And I'm sure we will have an insightful session. And like all of you, I look forward to a rewarding discussion. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Sivya. I will now hand over to Dr. Amitendra Palit, the chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramita, and thank you, Iqbal, and thank you all the speakers. It's delightful to have you, all of us, here today in this virtual space for discussing the IPEF. I will just very briefly follow up from where Iqbal left off. The IPEF has been a very important area of work for the Institute of South Asian Studies. And many of you, I'm so happy to share with the broader audience and participants today that many of you speaking here today are actually engaged with us in our core work on IPEF that ISAS is pursuing with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Japan program, the Regional Economic Program based out of Japan. And we have colleagues from CAS who have joined us here today. So thank you so much. I would like to welcome them as well, Rabia and other colleagues who have joined in this program. What I think is important for us to note is that when we started working on the IPEF, and the IPEF is just barely a year old from the time it was announced on 23rd of May 2022, I think in a way the IPEF's progress has taken most of us by surprise, because when we began this project, when we started consultations, when we looked at the way the IPEF will progress, it wasn't really a factor that we kept in mind that the IPEF might actually pick up a trajectory which is faster than the way normal FTA negotiations move. Normal FTA negotiations take time, and the IPEF has barely had 3 full rounds of negotiation, apart from in-person meetings, selective and virtual meetings as well. So these 3 or 4 rounds of negotiations appear to have produced a considerable degree of convergence on some of the areas that the IPEF is looking to make rules on, out of which the most significant one that is looking to have reached a stage of conclusion is the Pillar 2, which is the conversation on supply chains. And as Iqbal reiterated, it was late last month that the IPEF members agreed on a substantial conclusion of the discussions on Pillar 2. We are yet to see a ministerial text in this regard. But the overall impression is that this marks the capturing of a major milestone in the growth of the IPEF. And it is very likely that in the remaining part of the year, we have the Busan round coming up in Korea soon. And perhaps by November, when the APEC meeting is scheduled with most members of IPEF also a part of the APEC, there is a strong possibility that by November APEC meeting, we might see similar substantive conclusions being announced for the other pillars of the IPEF, which would mean that within a period of 1.5 years of time, the IPEF has really made substantial progress. We will discuss all that, but in the meantime, I wanted to start today's discussion by leaving this thought to all the panelists that what are your ideas on what the IPEF has done and achieved till now? And I would request all the panelists to share their initial remarks for 3 to 4 minutes on this. And I have great pleasure in inviting Mia Mikic as the first speaker. Mia, over to you.
I hope I successfully unmuted. So thank you.
You did.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to admit that I have actually noted few words on the screen just to make sure that I am within the 4 minutes that you prescribed. And I had difficulty actually to approach this initial statement because, you know, we look around ourselves, developments in the global environment, the faults in multilateral cooperations and negotiations, etc. And all of that is actually pushing us towards the way to be despondent about IPEF. In addition to that, my technical training as an economist, as a trade economist, nudges me towards to be very critical about IPEF, about its process, about the motivation, about the impacts on the parties, about the impacts on the third countries, and most of all about the impacts, systemic impacts on the multilateral trading system and global economy. Lastly, that really made my decision difficult was that if I was not critical to IPEF, I would be not true to the messages that my co-authors and myself put out in the recent T20 brief that was just published on friendshoring. And in my mind, and I think in mind of many people, IPEF can be seen as a modality of friendshoring. But that aside, I really tried hard to be positive about it. And the reason I try to be positive is because I am speaking from New Zealand. I'm not speaking on behalf of New Zealand or any agency or entities. I'm speaking on, in my personal standing. But I am influenced by the features of New Zealand economy. That it's a small open economy, traditionally agricultural one, but really with the huge appetite to become digital, knowledge-based, service-based, clean, inclusive, dynamic economy. And in that context, it is really looking at any possible mechanisms, platforms that would allow advancement of or protection, safeguarding, but also advancement of the rules-based systems in the world for trade and investment, but also possible opportunities and advancement of new sectors by controlling transaction costs in this, of course, environment of very high interest rates, etc. So New Zealand actually has never stopped being a strong supporter of WTO. It used RTAs to complement the support of multilateral agreements. But also it was a champion of very innovative policy options through the voluntary arrangements like APEC. And I think New Zealand looks at IPEF through the same lens. It looks at the IPEF and sees that apart from a couple of large traders, other members are in the same league as New Zealand. 7 members are members of CPTPP. And the question then asked is, what is the harm of being in IPEF for a country like New Zealand? And when you look at it from that perspective, then harm is really not to be seen. Actually, the advantage for New Zealand is that it opens the highway to US economy and Indian economy, because New Zealand doesn't have the other avenues to do that. And so I think the effort and energy of New Zealand has been put into moving agenda of IPEF in this context. And that's why it contributed positively, I think, towards achievements so far. Let me stop there. I had lots to say about the sort of issues with the systemic problems, but I hope I can add that later on. Sorry.
No, Mia, thank you so much. In fact, you have given us a large amount of food for thought. And one of the issues on which, 2 issues actually, on which I'd perhaps like to come back to you later, is that it does appear that among a large number of followers of trade, and by followers, I include policymakers, I include the business actors, I include the specialists, that there is this feeling, how well does the WTO mechanism and the rules-based trade framework going to sit with the IPEF, together, whether they will at all be able to be at the same table, number one. And number two, I also found this idea quite interesting, on which I'd probably like to check in with you as we go ahead, is that from a New Zealand perspective, the interest of being in IPEF, the India factor, might it have been the same had India been a member of the RCEP as well at some stage? So we'll come back to all that. There's a lot of suspense that is waiting to unveil itself. And on that note, Steve, who better to turn to but you? Please, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Amitendo, and a good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Heinrich Foundation, a very big thank you to ISAS for organizing this very timely session on short notice, which I know is not an easy thing to do. So thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I suppose, Amitendo, if I wanted to provide you with sort of a quick take in one sentence or so in terms of where we are, I would say that the successful conclusion of the supply chain pillar, the supply chain agreement, is certainly a welcome development and a shot of positive momentum. But I think it's still far too early to be popping any champagne corks for the IPEF just yet. And if I was to do sort of a quick and dirty back of the envelope assessment of the supply chain pillar, here's how I would break things down. In terms of the positives, when I look at it, I think this crisis response network that they've set up could be very, very useful. The basic idea is to scan the horizon, try to identify potential future supply chain disruptions before they materialize, send up sort of an early warning signal, and then coordinate collective responses. If something like that had been in place during the pandemic, I think at least some of the pain and suffering we all went through could have been mitigated at least somewhat. So I think that's at least something very, very positive. I also wanted to draw our attention to a couple of issues which frankly are not very glamorous, and so for that reason are easy to overlook. But again, I think potentially at least could be quite positive. And I point to technical assistance and capacity building. I think especially for some of the less developed members of IPEF, I think that could be very helpful in trying to introduce a greater degree of resiliency into the supply chains that cut across the IPEF members. And then the other thing, which again sounds very, very boring, and sounds unglamorous, but which I think can be important, is regulatory transparency. So if we flash back to the pandemic and to some of the acute disruptions that we suffered during the pandemic, we were in a very fast-moving crisis mode. And this meant that governments frequently had to change regulations or institute new regulations, in some instances, literally overnight. And businesses, of course, were caught flat-footed because they didn't know how to react to these things. So I think a little bit more advanced notification, a little bit more transparency into the regulatory process could stand us in good stead in times of future supply chain disruptions. In terms of areas where I've still got some concerns, the first area that I would flag is that it appears at least that the agreement is going to contain a lot of aspirational language, language like the parties shall seek to. Now, as a former trade negotiator myself, that sets off all sorts of alarm bells for me, because those softer commitments lead me to wonder, well, are the commitments and the obligations really going to be followed through in this agreement? Which ties to sort of a larger concern I have with this agreement, which is, and we've yet to see the final text, so it will be important to see the final text. But as I read the publicly available information, it seems to me what we've got in at least some areas is agreement that these are areas we're going to try to reach agreement. So a lot of the game still remains to be played out in some of these areas. So that's an area where I've got some concern. The other concern I have is strictly on the U.S. side of the ledger, and that is with the implementation process in the United States. The Biden administration has indicated it intends to implement this through executive order rather than seeking congressional approval. Not surprising, many powerful members of US Congress strongly disagree with that point of view. So we'll see if there's a bit of a battle brewing between the legislative and the executive branch over approval of IPEF and whether or not that might prove to be disruptive. The final point I'll make here on this US implementation question mark is to remind people that if anyone other than Joe Biden is elected president of the United States in 2024, please keep in mind that the new incoming president could, and in many instances, given who some of the contenders are, probably would undo the IPEF agreement with a stroke of his or her pen, because anything that's been put in place by executive order can be undone as a result of executive order. So again, my quick take bottom line is glad to see the progress, glad to see the agreement. Congratulations to the trade negotiators who I'm sure are exhausted, but at least for now, let's continue to keep the champagne on ice.
Thank you so much, Steve. In fact, as always, you've really been very candid. You have brought the core issues to the table. And I really think that there is considerable merit in viewing the IPEF through the prism through which you took us into the content of the IPEF, and particularly your shared skepticism over the fact that there is a political change in the United States. Might we see the CPTPP episode being played out again? So whether that would be a reality or not, and what might be the implications of it for the rest of the members. Thanks, Steve. So I now have the pleasure of calling on Dr. Radhika Kumar. Radhika, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amit, and thank you for inviting me to this discussions. First of all, just a disclaimer, the views are mine and not of any person or organization before I speak on this. So first, I will just try to touch a bit on overall on what IPEF means. Of course, as a trade negotiator in the WTO and at regional levels, I would say that this is one of the fastest trade deal ever that is moving in the trading blocks. But and I think most because of perhaps it's the interest of the countries that are involved in the negotiations. I do note there's countries at different levels of development. So I will speak from a developing country perspective. Of course, coming from Fiji, so more of a small island state as well. And I see what I see in IPEF is something which we normally see in negotiations is basically what certain group of countries with certain interests do not get in one fora, then they try to get a particular deal in another fora with a group of countries with common interest or common regional integration deals. So I think I see IPEF as the same. I give you an example because, for example, there are certain IPEF members, say Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and the other Pacific countries. They were negotiating this PESA Plus agreement for a long time. But of course, there are certain countries in the Pacific region that has actually ratified the agreement. But Fiji, though, had been in the negotiations, they are not part of the ratification or now implementation. But then again, I see IPEF as a way for then countries like Fiji to then access greater markets, and also for Australia and New Zealand to get perhaps a further discussion with certain countries of interest. And in this case, Fiji is one of the major economies, I'd say, in the Pacific region. So of course, through this another forum, there could be some deals done. However, saying that from a WTO multilateral perspective, even when I read the first launch of the negotiations, I could see something which I now see reflective. And I would say, though, because we all know that tariffs are coming down for countries, But of course, the non-tariff measures are something, I'm not talking about like this, not talking about non-tariff barriers, but non-tariff measures is something which countries need to comply with. And even in the IPEF supply chain, although it's a milestone agreement, and I know that countries are looking towards resilient, reliable and efficient supply chains, which is a plus. But then, of course, the implementation has to be assessed, because from how I read as a trade negotiator, I see even through what is online publicly available information, there will be issues in terms of complying with certain non-tariff measures or standards. And these are basically sort of new issues. So, of course, capacity is one of the issues which certain countries might grapple with, not all. For example, US would already have that level of capacity. There might be other developed countries, but for the others, they might need to kind of have that capacity. Now, I'll just pull one of the areas. Of course, if I'm looking at the IPEF Labor Rights Advisory Board. Now, this, if I'm reading from a negotiation perspective, this is basically dealing with issues on trade and labor rights, and this is not something which has been new, right? Of course, we know that members will need to uphold and promote the labor rights within the supply chains. And even in the WTO, if you look at the ministerial conference of December 1996, this issue was actually raised in a ministerial declaration, but this was a 1996 issue. But in that, what ministers basically said is that, of course, they will collaborate with ILO and look at these issues. But then there was one of the lines there where ministers were trying to say that we will reject the use of labor standards for protectionist purposes and agree that the comparative advantage of countries, particularly low-wage developing countries, must in no way be put into question. So in this regard, we know that WTO and ILO Secretariat will continue their existing collaborations. So in the context of the IPEF, of course, as countries move into perhaps finalizing the text or implementing the agreement in future, while addressing the labor rights issues, which is critical for all countries, and it's of concern, they will need to also comply, in other words, with certain labor rights measures and standards. So the question comes is that countries who are maybe not that advanced in the negotiations may need to reflect on what kind of assistance they need to comply with the standards, because otherwise the supply chain deal will be there, which is great, but then the comparative advantage and the advantage for certain countries will be greater in terms of integration into the supply chain than others. Then if I link that with the supply chain crisis response network, of course, it's great. In an event of a crisis, you need quick responses. But again, if I read that all together, then countries that will be compliant with the, for example, the labor rights and within the standards, if they meet the non-tariff measures, will be able to then kind of integrate into the supply chain better, right? And they would be the ones who would be responding quicker to the network. So there's a market access dimension, which I'm seeing very clearly, but this time the market access is in terms of standards. Having said that, of course, this was supply chain agreement was much needed, right? Because things are moving, we are moving into new issues, new things, trade has evolved, so we need it. But at the same time, we just need to ensure how the members' capacity in the text would be built in future to ensure that all of them are fully taking advantage of this IPEF agreement. And if I may, if I still have time, in terms of the IPEF Supply Chain Council, of course, it is again a good thing. But then, of course, there's it says that the council will be tasked to oversee the development of sector-specific action plans. Now, I also just tried to look at some of the sector-specific action plans, and I could see the US comprehensive critical manufacturing sector specific plan, which is comprehensive. Now, I don't know how the text is evolving because we don't have the legal text, but of course, to what is there, though the determination of the critical sectors is up to the countries, but then how will their sector specific plan be also monitored?
Radhika, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
we will come back
Yes,
to
yes.
this subject again, but
Okay, sure.
if you don't mind,
Yeah.
any other point you want to mention at this stage?
No, I will
Thank
pick
you.
it up later.
Thank you so much. My apologies. I just wanted to, take that very important point that you raised into a second round of discussion, specifically on the critical sectors. Now, if I could move on to Mr. Shumanto Chaudhary, now currently with the CII, but Shumanto Chaudhary has been known to the world of trade as a very experienced and veteran negotiator from India for a large number of years, and of course, also from his positions in the government of India. Shumanto, welcome to the program. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Amitendo, and let me start by thanking ISS, I think, for holding this very topical webinar. Now, let me sort of start by saying that if I were to see the journey of IPEF the last 1 year, I would say skepticism, curiosity, and to a certain amount surprise, and maybe a little bit of silent admiration at the fact that you have managed to get at least one pillar, some kind of consensus. But having said that, to some extent, I think there is a word of caution, as again, we don't know the text, but looking at what the supply chain pillar has done, perhaps this is just the broad principles, either of what might be the overarching kind of architecture or the kind of actions that are proposed to be taken in the future. So to some extent, the battle actually goes into the future. And that's where I think perhaps the same element of consensus may not be so easily forthcoming, given the very divergent nature of the economies that make up this group. But a second point, and this is something as sort of, as you said, as a veteran trade negotiator, certainly the fact that you have been able to stitch together an agreement in a fairly short time period, perhaps does speak of a certain spirit of cooperation and accommodation. And I only hope that this continues because while it's easier to do this on the softer part, when things are sort of more difficult, they go into deep dive, that's where the problems start to emerge. But in that sense, perhaps moving away from a world where unilateralism, confrontation, and so on became in some sense more part of it. So that extent, I think, getting back to a more collaborative framework, which the IPEF supply chain has to some extent done, is a positive thing. But as I said, one has to really wait and see as to how this will pan out as the details go. Second, essentially, we'll come back to this, but just the institutional structures that have been created, again, from what we've seen either in the public summaries or the press statement and so on, obviously the action will shift to each of these different institutional bodies, whether it's on Supply Chain Council, whether it's on the crisis response, whether it's on the Labor Rights Advisory Board, and so on. And there could be more. So this, of course, one will have to see how it pans out. The second point which I would make here is this question of its relationship vis-a-vis the other structures and agreements, starting from the multilateral. And my frank opinion is that whether even in the absence of this agreement, whether the multilateral system would in fact make more headway is a matter of, I would say, of some conjecture. Perhaps not. The kind of quagmire that it finds itself. But to the extent that alternatives start to emerge, therefore the incentive to get the multilateral system back in full speed becomes that much lower. So to that extent, perhaps indirectly, and that is not true of just the IPEF. It's true of any alternative that you kind of set. And when a large number of members start getting used to these alternatives, then perhaps the first best option starts to get diluted even more. So that's a danger, not just of the IPF, but of this entire kind of things. Second, its relationship, and I think my earlier speakers have alluded to the fact that there are a lot of common members within both the RCEP and the CPTP community, along with the IPF. And to some extent, it's really US, India, and Fiji, which in some sense are not part of both. But so therefore, this is another question. For the remaining, of course, they have other kinds of architecture which also sort of bind them into a more integrated, though albeit in a more conventional sort of tariff-led kind of initiative. So this is again something that one will have to see, the relationship of these agreements, whether it's the CPTP, the RCEP. You talked about ASEAN, and there was a time when this entire region, it used to be about ASEAN centrality, and the other partner countries or the dialogue partners started +3, +6, went into RCEP and so on. So this entire evolutionary process, and to a larger sort of geographical territory of the Indo-Pacific, how do these agreements play vis-a-vis the IPF? So this is a third point, I think, which only to some extent time will tell, but this will be an important consideration given the fact that there is in the IPF members who are either part of it or who are not part of it, and therefore have a sense of divergent relationships with these other architectures that are already existing in the region. So these would be some of my preliminary observations. And I think I'll stop here because there is a lot of specifics, but I'll wait for maybe another round in order to get into those specifics. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, Shrimantoda, for those observations. In fact, you have kind of brought us to the core of the issues in line with what Mia, Steve, and Radhika have already mentioned. And Jayant, if I could now turn to you, you have a bit of a challenge, which I'm sure, as always, you will wonderfully overcome. I mean, you are wearing the Malaysian hat as well as the ASEAN hat over here today. So in terms of perspective, in terms of what you see from the IPEF till now, please, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Amitendo. Malaysian hat, ASEAN perspective, but I'm in Cambodia at the moment, which has not been invited to join IPEF. So
the outsider perspective as well.
Well, and you talk about ASEAN centrality and unity, which the US keeps referring to, and you have 3 ASEAN members that are not been invited, that have not been invited. So make of that what you will. But let me thank you and ISAS for having me. You told me that I'll be the last speaker, so I planned carefully to try and say something that was new, but still somewhat interesting, expecting that others would have already probably said all the interesting stuff already. So I thought I would talk about 2 issues. Luckily, it hasn't been talked about much, but has been touched upon. The first is the political economy context within which IPEF is created, or was created by the US. So I think it's important to understand where it's coming from and what the US hopes to achieve. And that's the first point. The second point I want to talk about is this much discussed issue of market access or lack thereof, and what that really means and whether in fact that's actually true. And here I'll refer to Malaysian examples, but also ASEAN. Okay, so I think the first thing to realize is that, IPEF has come from a very different environment in US policy settings under President Biden. Unlike the past or the last few decades where US trade policy was run mainly by the US Trade Representative or the USTR, more recently, and especially under President Biden, this has shifted to the Commerce Department, right? And I think this matters because unlike the USTR, whose mission is to promote trade and investment through liberalization and promoting a rules-based order, the Commerce Department has a slightly different mandate. And they're focused on defending and promoting US companies and protecting US technologies. In fact, in IPEF, as you know, except for the trade pillar, everything else is actually being managed by Commerce. And it's the Commerce Department that has been overseeing the rollout of the massive subsidies being offered to reshore semiconductor manufacturing back to the US, and restricting sales of advanced US technologies to various Chinese companies. And apart from that, of course, we know that there's huge subsidies being offered under the Inflation Reduction Act and so on to the production of clean energy, electric vehicles. And these are already affecting competitors around the world, not just in China, but also in Europe and elsewhere, right? So the stark contrast, I think, between the USTR and the Commerce Department is also why IPEF is a White House initiative. The USTR and Commerce Department simply could not come to agreement on how the IPEF should be structured. And so the White House was forced to take it over. This act comes from a former USTR that I won't name. So it's just not my view, it's an insider's perspective. This context is important, I think, because it reveals a lot of the motivation driving IPEF that others have already referred to. At one level, the US expects, I think, to get IPEF members to buy into its resilience and competitiveness framework, and basically support its national security interests by limiting engagement and dependency on countries that do not pose what it sees as a national security threat. One particularly large country whose name starts with C comes to mind. I think this is also evident from the recent supply chain agreement. But I know time is short, so I won't get into that now, but maybe we can come back to that a bit later. Let me move on to the second point about market access. We are reminded at almost every opportunity that IPEF is not an FTA and it's not a traditional trade agreement, and that it doesn't deal with market access provisions, and this is greatly lamented. But I think IPEF is very much about market access, but just not in the way that it's traditionally understood. That is, there's no exchange of tariff or other concessions that may benefit everyone else except the US. While it might not improve market access of IPEF members to the US, it will certainly improve market access of US firms to other member markets. Because almost every item up for negotiation and discussion, whether it's environmental standards, labor standards, or what have you, will affect competitiveness, right? And will affect the ability of US firms to compete in this region. So it is very much about market access, but only one country's market access at the possible expense of others. Okay, so I've been a bit negative, but let me try and end on a slightly positive note, and this is my last point. I think IPEF members can benefit in other ways with respect to market access, however. And let me use Malaysia as an example here. For Malaysia, it's not so much about increasing market access to the US, which the IPEF doesn't currently include, but may be forced to in the future, but rather about restoring and preserving market access. That is, reversing the remaining withhold release orders that currently ban exports to the US market and ensuring that the ease and frequency with which trade sanctions are applied in the future is better managed. The increasing influence of the US Department of Commerce in setting the trade agenda has increased the weaponization of trade policy and its impact on a growing number of non-trade related areas. And this can cause significant disruption to countries on the receiving end, of which Malaysia is only one. But I think many countries in ASEAN are also equally concerned. So in a sense, I think with Biden, Ms. Gina Raimondo has trumped Ms. Catherine Tai in control of power and policy settings on the trade front. So let me stop there, and I look forward to coming back to the supply chain agreement and other issues in the discussion later. Amitando, back to you.
Thank you, Jayant. And I think I congratulate myself on putting you down as the last, but in no way the very least in this very eminent panel of speakers, because almost as always, you have come very, very close to delivering the last word on the subject and left us with fundamental truths in both the points that you raised. Thank you so much, Jayant, for that. I now want to get into a little bit more of contextual specific discussions on 2 or 3 major issues that have emerged from what you all have shared here today. And at the same time, I would also like to request the participants, if you have questions, please feel free to post them on the chat box. We would like to take those questions and share it with our panelists. Now, one of the fundamental points, and Mia, I would like to sort of start with this with you. One of the sentiments that is coming out and pretty evident from what we have heard till now is that there seems to be a bit of an uncomfortable repetition of history, which is in the pipeline over here. You know, this is kind of getting back to the year 2015 and 16. 2016 was the United States election year. 2024 will be the United States election year. By the end of 2015 and early 2016, we saw the TPP, the then TPP, being substantially concluded. Before it was taken to the Congress, President Obama was holding the TPA at that point in time. Today, President Biden doesn't have the TPA. He's not going to go to the Congress. As Steve alerted us, it's going to go to the executive orders, so it might as well see the light of the day. But given what Steve further said, and there is this greater idea that there might be a substantive political change in the US after 2024. And the prospect of the new incoming US administration taking a completely different view on IPEF cannot be discounted at all. Do you think that the previous experience with the TPP, where the US actually backed out, and the US market was actually a very important glue for a lot of countries to come together in the TPP at that point in time, and they were let down by the US backing out, both strategically as well as economically. Do you think that a recurrence of that experience, which might be just in the pipeline, might be something which is there at the back of the mind of the remaining IPEF members? Is that something which is going to be a bit of a concern as the IPEF moves on? Because obviously there will be this thought that the US, if the US doesn't stay engaged in the game 2024 onwards due to internal political developments, then who's going to drive the IPEF? Who's going to take forward the regional route setting process? So do you think, Mia, that might be a concern for a large number of economies? And this, while I begin with you, I also like to request my other panelists to kindly raise your hands or feel free to jump in. Yes, Mia, over to you.
Thank you. This is a tough one, and I may be an outlier, but I don't think that the membership of IPEF actually rely on US in driving certain agendas here. We are in a situation where you have a really very difficult global environment, and many countries, small and medium-sized countries, are trying to find a fora where they can be starting to set the rules. And I'll just give you the example of the digital part of the negotiation that actually collapsed, or were stopped because these small and medium-sized countries actually refused to accept the text that was provided by the US, pointing to their different interests. Right. So I think there is a sufficient critical mass there of countries that are like-minded in the group outside US that may find this a useful platform to continue their negotiation that they have already started, like in DPAS or in some other platforms, and that will use that to deepen this, or to attract maybe some other members into these other agreements, and to create something new in terms of rules to complement the void that we, or to close the void rather, that we currently have in terms of creation of new rules at the WTO level. So I wouldn't see it really as while it was started by US president, right, in terms of talk, and why it is being welcomed as a potential return of US to Asia Pacific, or to Indo-Pacific, because it came short in terms of really offering tariff concessions. Although I agree with Jay in terms of saying that there is a bucket of market access there in a separate of tariff access that needs to be explored and used. I don't think that these other members are really there just because of US. I think there are, there are other motivations there as well. And I think small and medium-sized countries have actually learned that as long as they can engage in some sort of cooperation, that is helpful. And just one more sentence to link it to that, so this supply chain talks about transparency as a big impact to be had. Now we have one of the major principles of the WTO system is transparency, and the countries don't use it. They don't use it because perhaps, particularly in the crisis situation as we had in 2020, they didn't trust each other. So why do we think they will be trusting each other in a small environment? Because we have already selected this subset of countries, and maybe this mechanism will work. But the other question is then how you will prevent other countries to benefit from that transparency, because it's very hard to be transparent in a subset and precluding others. So there are potential of benefits for others from these non-traditional changes in behavior of countries, like transparencies, like implementing better regulatory practices, etc., where it's very difficult actually to prevent third parties, as we know from trade facilitation practices, to benefit from that when we come to standards, etc. So let me leave it at that, and we'll hear from others as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Mia. Definitely, yes. Steve, I could see you raising your hand. I'm sure you didn't do it subconsciously, but consciously. Yes, please.
Thanks very much, Amitendo. Well, look, here's what I would say. If I was advising the non-US members of IPEF, I would say, look, if you are worried about the staying power of the US, if you're worried you might be living through deja vu all over again and go through the same thing that you went through with the US with TPP, I would say your fears and your concerns are 100% justified. I mean, let's just be clear. If you have Donald Trump, if you have Ron DeSantis, if you have virtually any of the other primary contenders in the US political spectrum on the first day in office, expect IPEF to be undone. But then I would say, nonetheless, it is still worth your while to stay in this. You cannot control the US political process. You cannot predict the US political process. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen. Keep your shoulder to the grindstone. Do your work. Work in good faith. The US political situation will take care of itself. If the US pulls out and you feel like the whole thing collapses as a result, okay, then you can leave as well. But I think the likelihood, I think the greater likelihood is what Mia suggested, which is they'll look at it and they'll say, well, look, we would have preferred that the US still stay in, but even if the US pulls out, we have done enough good work here. We have made enough substantive progress that it is still worth our while to stay in. And since we're alluding back to the TPP experience, I have to mention, don't forget, when the United States first pulled out of TPP, the absolute consensus was TPP without the United States, impossible. It's dead in the water. And then people took a breath. They thought about it a little bit more. And to this day, I remember, these words are now comical to us now. Shinzo Abe's first comment after the US pulled out of the TPP and the possibility of the TPP going on without the United States was, and I quote, TPP without the United States is like the Beatles without Paul McCartney. And turns out the Beatles did a pretty good job without Paul McCartney, because then, as you recall, Japan was the leading force behind picking up the pieces and moving forward with TPP without the United States. So don't preclude the IPEF still living, even if the US collapses. So I would say, keep doing your work. You can't control the US political process, and assess after the election where you are then.
That's a wonderful exposition, Steve, though I must say that one variable to be considered is that the world doesn't have somebody like Shinzo Abe anymore. So whether that kind of a personality which really went into the salvaging of the TPP will be required to be muscled in, if at all the IPEF faces a prospect like that. Something we will wait and see. But I do agree with your broad point. I think it's important to stay engaged and committed to the process, and much will thereafter follow. But on this note, I just wanted to reflect on another point, and this is where, Shumotoda, I wanted to bring you in. When we look at normal trade agreements that are being discussed and debated across the world over, including where countries like India and many of the other IPEF members are otherwise engaged in, from the experience that we have had before COVID and even thereafter, free trade agreements don't really very explicitly, specifically talk about supply chains. As such, don't. Perhaps it is implicit. Perhaps it is implicit. Perhaps it is through the overall reduction in trade barriers that they want to achieve the objective of greater efficiency in supply chains. But what the IPEF is doing is a very different, ball game altogether, in the sense that it has started from the greater objective that supply chains are in severe distress, which is a fact. They have been under distress both from the supply side as well as the demand side, and they need to be buckled up. So there is an agenda that needs to come in that respect. That agenda requires mapping out of critical sectors. That agenda requires crisis coordination. That agenda requires advanced sharing. Now, all these in a very specific sense, I wanted to check this out with you from your negotiating experience. These are all going to be instructions and suggestions and rules which will be there for the businesses to be taken, but these are the same businesses which will also have to coexist with their roles in other FTAs. Let's say, for example, from an Indian business or an Indian industry perspective, there are engagements going on with the European Union. There is a free trade agreement bilaterally with Australia. There is partnership in the ASEAN FTA. All those are market access, tariff, non-tariff specific existences. And then there is an IPEF, which is talking about mechanisms for supply chain resilience. Do you think there is an element of divergence over here? Is it possible that these can all actually sit together from a negotiator's perspective? How do you look at this?
So thanks, Amitendra. I think that is certainly an important question. Now, as far as traditional sort of agreements, and now even the larger, newer age, but they are still free trade agreements, nevertheless. Supply chain, and you're right, is sort of not perhaps the sort of direct sort of benefit that you see, but as you sort of lower your tariffs, whether it's for intermediates, raw materials, capital goods, and so on. So therefore, it does have a certain element of, I would say, buy-in into the supply chain as far as this narrow element is concerned, but not necessarily in terms of many of the other elements that you yourself mentioned, whether because that normally the trade agreements do not be. And second, that brings me, in fact, to what you've alluded to. In that sense, the IPEF, the traditional or even the so-called free trade agreements that we have seen, largely deal with governmental measures. They are really, in that sense, talking about measures taken by governments, and of course, whether it's the federal government, the state government, or the local governments, and so on. But in the case of IPEF, and particularly supply chains, if you look, a large part of the action depends directly on the private sector, whether it is in terms of data flow or information, which would be the first stage from which you build, or willingness to kind of compete even with maybe perceived competitors, if I may use the word. So this is a challenge. Now, it's true that even in trade agreements, it's ultimately private businesses and industry which have to take advantage. Governments merely set a platform, and ultimately it's the business or industry which has to get in. But to that extent, I would say that for businesses, perhaps the more traditional, conventional one, where there's a direct kind of thing which they can see, is perhaps easier for them to do. This one is, in some sense, more difficult, and it also runs into the question of what they might view as confidential and they may not want to disclose, and so on. We've not even touched upon this, but in the IPEF, if you're really going to move forward in some of this, this is going to be a dilemma which you will have to solve. And this is something which I certainly do see as a difficult one. How exactly or what exactly does the IPEF offer that would make the private sector behave differently and do what they are expected to do? That is, reveal more. Why should I do it if I were a business or industry, unless I perceive very significant sort of benefit? So this to me is a bit of a dilemma. It's not entirely clear how you will get over this in the IPEF. And I won't say that the two are entirely divergent, in the sense that theoretically you could have a world where the traditional FTA kind of agreements coexist with this kind. But for businesses, I certainly do believe that perhaps apart from the US, and this is an asymmetry which is even more, the governments of the 14 member countries have certainly are on board. But as far as the private sector engagement goes, I am not too sure whether that same level of engagement is across all the sort of 14 member countries of IPEF. And this is, I think, an added sort of thing, given the fact that a lot of these pillars' success will depend on private sector engagement, simply beyond being an actor, which they are to take advantage of opportunities in conventional agreements. So this is much, much more different.
Thank you, Shumantoda. I think the IPEF is a very strange creature in the sense that it will keep on creating more and more complications as it goes ahead in a very twisted manner. So in a sense, it's going to be an extremely interesting framework to study, but it might not necessarily, be the most effective way of achieving certain means and ends at the same time. Radhika, if I could come back to you on the question of supply chains again, one of the fundamental features of what the supply chains agreement is going to eventually comprise of is this mapping of critical sectors. Now, the critical sector business has actually been left to the members. The members are going to suggest what they consider as critical sectors. We are not entirely sure whether there would be qualitative or quantitative criteria that are being proposed in the agreement for figuring out critical sectors, because it's not that the agreement can take a completely static view of things. There are sectors that might emerge in future which might be critical sectors. They might not be so today. So I think that element has to be looked into consideration. But what is important, Radhika, is that look, even for a country like Fiji, a small economy, being a part of supply chains, there is an IPEF family, and the IPEF family is proposing critical sectors. But for a country like Fiji, for a country like India, for a country like New Zealand, and many other countries, there's a considerable amount of sourcing that happens in a large number of items, which is from outside the IPEF. Is there a concern in Fiji, for example, that if there are parameters and ideas coming up with respect to the whole business of critical sectors, let us say pharmaceutical, energy, food, and the sourcing that these countries do, the IPEF members do from outside the IPEF, do you have a feeling that there is a concern that the IPEF rules might actually get to affect the kind of sourcing that is happening from outside the IPEF? Is there a concern in that regard? I think from India, there have been some concerns expressed by the pharmaceutical industry in this regard, that whether in some way non-IPEF sourcing will be impacted by this. Is there a similar concern in Fiji? Radhika, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So first of all, I will not kind of directly speak on Fiji because I have not consulted the country per se. So I will not be like Fiji specific, but yes, from a developing country perspective, yes, even in the Pacific region with the agreements that Fiji is part of course they are sourcing raw materials from other countries, right? The non-traditional partners, even within the Pacific region, minus like Australia and New Zealand, they are countries that they source certain raw materials from. Certain, of course, are because, for instance, sourcing mostly it would be from Australia and New Zealand, but then again, there are countries, of course, China is one of the countries where raw materials and products are sourced from. So of course, there would be there could be a likely concern because now through this agreement, and that's why what I was trying to previously emphasize on standards. If though this is a supply chain cooperation kind of agreement, at the moment we do not know the text, but the scope and the depth of the requirements to integrate into this supply chain will really matter, even if it is talking about standards, right? Even I think the previous speaker mentioned about private standards, but whose standard will Fiji need to comply with in terms of the private standards will matter, and then their compliance level will actually matter, even to integrate into the supply chain, source raw materials from these countries, or even value add and then go into the supply chain again, right? So that would perhaps that's where the NTMs will be. And of course, with that, though these institutions that are created, but then they are dealing with issues which actually were new issues, some were contentious in the WTO as well, like trade and labor issues. These would also play a critical role that countries will need to, of course, comply with these standards. And to what extent their standards will meet that requirements will determine their integration and, of course, sourcing. Another thing is, of course, just to add, in relation to the sector-specific action plans, which for the critical sectors, which countries might need to develop, right? For the larger countries, it might be easier for them to easily develop those plans. But for a country like Fiji or any other smaller countries, there's a question in terms of what may need to be developed in terms of a robust plan, and will that plan now be in compliant with the supply chain integration rules? That is not really set out from what is the reading on what we get publicly available online, but from a negotiator perspective, though this is broad principles, but if you are going into textual details and like an agreement, though it may be soft language, but if there's a commitment to implement it, then there would be some heavy undertakings that countries will need to do, be it themselves or be it through assistance. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Radhika. That's a very valuable perspective to have. And I now want to move to Jayant. Jayant, you might have seen that on the chat box, we have one of the participants, Gitanjali Natraj, who herself is a distinguished trade expert from India, putting up this question as to why India is not a part of the trade pillar. And there are concerns over the, quote unquote, controversial business that IPEF trade pillar is engaged in terms of labor, digital standards, environment, and so on and so forth. I'm not asking you to comment on the Indian perspective, but what I just wanted to check out with you is that, the US has found a way out in the sense that, as Steve very clearly explained to us, this is not going to go to the Congress. This is going to pass through the executive and come out as a framework. That might not be so for a large number of other IPEF members, in the sense that when certain issues need to be locked onto, labor, for example, and whether it doesn't really matter whether India is not a part of the trade pillar. The labor issue is sitting in a fairly creamy patch in the pillar 2 as well. There is the Labor Rights Council. And what's very interesting, Jayant, and I wanted to share this with all of you, if you might have already noticed, if one looks at the text, which was the summary statement that came out from the Commerce Department of the US, it talks about the Labor Advisory Board, which is tripartite in character. The immediate next sentence is that there's going to be a subcommittee which is going to comprise of government experts. There's no mention about the tripartism over there. Now, these are contradictory signals. And when the domestic constituencies pick wind of this, there's going to be some political challenge which the IPEF members are going to encounter. And I'm pretty much sure that's going to be a situation in Malaysia. That might be a problem in Thailand. It's clearly going to be a problem in India. It might even be a problem in Australia and New Zealand to some extent. What's your take on this? You think the labor business is going to get something which is going to be complicated to handle by the non-US IPEF members?
Right. Okay. I think that's a difficult one, but I would say this. I think if we go back to the comparison with the TPP. TPP survived. The TPP didn't survive. It transformed into the CPTPP, where all the bits that favored US multinationals in intellectual property were removed. And these were the bad bits, in my view, especially on patents, the biologics, and so on. And this made it palatable. I think a similar thing might happen here, where I don't think there's any real enforcement measures. I don't think these IPEF members are going to want to turn this into law when the US won't do the same with their Congress, right? So I think what will happen is they will do the bits that are in their interest and ignore the rest. And the labor issue is certainly going to be ignored, right? They might want to address it to the extent that it affects their ability to export to the US, right? So this is like Malaysia again with the withhold release orders. They're willing to, make changes if they feel that this will end up removing the ban on exports, because that really matters, right? That's the market access restoration that they are willing to do things about to try and get back to the situation before the withhold release order was imposed upon them. We've seen that also with the transshipment sort of bans that have been put in place with a lot of the solar products, which was coincidentally removed 2 weeks after IPEF was announced, right? That's no coincidence. The US is certainly willing, I think, to look at these issues in a sort of informal negotiation on market access. But I think the bigger issue, if I may, for ASEAN, you asked me to talk about ASEAN earlier, with relation to the supply chain agreement, is the fact that IPEF is missing China, right? And ASEAN supply chains are very much and will remain broadly China-centered. So you might be able to have the Beatles without Paul McCartney, but this is like Elizabethan drama unfolding without Shakespeare, which is a bit more dramatic, so to say. I don't think it will be palatable for ASEAN members to cut off their noses to spite their face by asking them to participate in this great power competition. And I think the private sector, this comes back to the point being made earlier by Samantha, I think there's a greater divergence between what governments want to do and the private sector want to do, right? The private sector doesn't care that much, I think, about the great power competition, just like the other IPEF members, right? And the disconnect between the two is growing. But luckily, they can ignore this because this is not enforceable. So they'll take all the capacity building and the training that's being, dangled in front of them and implement only the bits that they feel are in their interest, and all the rest, which is a lot, which involves the US imposing their national security interests on this region, will probably end up just being pushed to the side.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jayant. That's very instructive as always. And Steve, as you would note, and you would agree with me, Jayant really doesn't have too much of faith on one Mr. John Lennon carrying the burden of Beatles without his colleague on board. But we will not talk too much about that. What we will do is that we started a few minutes late, and I have the sort of authority to go ahead for another 5 minutes. So there's one question on which I would request all the panelists to take 90 seconds to respond. How confident are you of the IPEF being concluded by the November APEC summit? Mia, we will follow the same batting order as we did. Over to you.
Well, and I will keep my positive sort of hat on. You can conclude absolutely anything as long you are willing to dilute it to the level at which you will, be able to conclude. So if there is a face-saving need to actually deliver something, then I think it might be possible. It will not definitely have digital, and it will not have other issues. What I'm more worried is that concluding it and announcing it at the leaders meeting of APEC is actually do a great damage to APEC process. And that we didn't have time to discuss it about the synergies and interactions of these processes, but I think it's very worthwhile to keep thinking about that.
Thank you,
Mia. That's my 90 seconds. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you for being so economical as always in time managing. You really make, a moderator's life so easy. Steve, over to you.
Amatendo, I will make your life even easier. I can be extremely short and sweet. The US negotiators have clear marching orders from the White House. Something will be done by November. My fear, if not my expectation, is that whatever is produced will be extremely low in ambition, because it's really, really hard to do anything meaningful in this very tight timeline. So there will be something to announce with much pomp and circumstance that Biden will preside over in San Francisco in November. I fear, however, it could be very, very low ambition, low quality agreements.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Radhika, what are your thoughts? APEC November meeting?
I think there's two sides to the coin. I'd say it could be concluded, but as others have mentioned about the scope and depth of the other issues, trade, energy, tax, anti-corruption, they are large issues. But if the scope and depth is low, it will be concluded. But if negotiators go into the scope and depth and go deeper, then it might be delayed. So it could go either way.
Thank you so much. Shumantoda.
I don't differ from what most have said, in the sense that there's always this, I would say, choice between time and scope and depth, as Radhika sort of says. So if you want to choose the outcome, the first option of having some outcome, possible in November, but perhaps with a slight word of caution on the trade pillar. I think that is the one which is perhaps in some sense, the umbrella, or which, even though the pillars are different, but there are connections between all the other pillars. So perhaps the sequence to be followed, as I perceive, is you've done the supply chain, you'll probably want to do 3 and 4, and then sort of in terms of sequencing, move to the trade pillar. So that's one. The second is you still sort of do something, but you shift the battle to a future date, which means what you agree to is in some sense a much hollower version, and the real decision making gets into either the institutional structures or the decisions that you actually perhaps don't fully take and leave for the future. So these are, I think, two possibilities that I see.
Thank you, Shumantoda. Jayant, back to you again.
I don't have much to add. I agree with what's just been said about, they will probably have to deliver something and it won't be very deep. But let me illustrate that with the supply chain agreement, right? I think this is a very good example of almost nothing agreement, right? And why I say that is, the key aspect seems to be this early warning system, right? And I don't see what all the great fanfare is about. Ms. Raimunda said it would have helped us during the pandemic. The pandemic was a situation where almost all countries shut down completely. Any kind of early warning system would not have predicted the pandemic, would have done nothing to actually help countries adjust. In fact, I think it was remarkable how resilient supply chains were during the pandemic, and it helped with the recovery as it was. Countries are not willing to share much information freely. We know this already, even though there's a high level of interdependence. I think just setting up a network that says, let's tell each other all our secrets so that we can all avoid a crisis. This has been tried in ASEAN +3 after the Asian financial crisis, and it's basically a beauty contest. Everyone tries to hide vulnerabilities rather than expose them. And I think, I'm probably a bit too skeptical about this, but I don't think it will have much of an impact. In fact, it's probably more harmful if it's, all about pushing China out. And I think this is a leading indicator of what to expect from all the other pillars, which is very thin, but lots of fanfare.
Thank you, Jayant, and thank you as always for being candid and for being, very focused and to the point. I'm afraid we won't be able to go on too much longer. I would like to bring the discussions to a close, and I'm not going to summarize. I think this has been an extremely appetizing discussion, given by the fact, if I could take a recourse to a quantitative indicator. Normally, all webinars start with a number of participants, which peters towards the end as the webinar progresses. This is one of those webinars where we had the number totally intact. And we don't even know how many has joined us live on Facebook. We normally have a very, very large audience coming in from the Facebook. It's to the quality of all of you guys who have really been splendid. I want to thank all of you from my side, from the ISAS side. I want to just leave you with one thought at this point in time, as Iqbal mentioned in the beginning, and as I also emphasized. The IPEF is a very important area of work for us, and many of you are already working with us on the IPEF. And for those of you who have joined us from the outside, I'd like to bring to your notice that in partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Regional Economic Program in Japan, ISAS is preparing a bunch of papers which are capturing the country perspectives on the IPEF, its content, its negotiating challenges. We are going to put out these papers in the public domain from the month of August. Several of the experts who have spoken here today are contributing to the papers, and there are more who are with us today or for whatever reasons they couldn't join us. So just watch out for the website, for the ISAS announcements on this, and we would be very happy to share with you more perspectives. On behalf of the ISAS, I would like to thank Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia, my colleague Harnik Singh, Deputy Director of ISAS, Sitara, my other colleagues, Jordan, Yusuf, who have all put together the technicalities of this program. And last but not the least, to my colleague Ramita, who really has been the driving pillar of the IPEF engagement at ISAS. A very good evening, good afternoon, and a good day to all of you. We look forward to catching up with you very soon again. Take care, stay safe, and stay connected. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Everyone.